This is the first Ionic and Angular project that we're going to build in this series. This is the LinkedIn clone. Now this is the second video in the full stack series where we're using Ionic, Angular, Nest.js and Postgres all together to make a full stack LinkedIn clone. However, this series can be watched in isolation, so you can watch the Ionic and Angular parts if you're just interested in building the front end out. And likewise, you can just watch the Nest and Postgres series if you want to just focus on the back end, or you can take the full stack and watch videos from both the front end and back end project. So in this video we're going to introduce Ionic. We're going to explain what Ionic is and what it's used for, and we're going to build this navigation bar for the LinkedIn clone. And as you can see, there is this controller here that can pop over and display some of the features that you may want to be going to, some of the routes you want to be going to. Now this is all just hard coded for now, and we have a sign out here, which is a function here. It's just console logs for now. We will add role-based authentication to this app in a subsequent video. But for now, we're just going to start with explaining why Ionic, why it's so powerful and useful for an Angular developer, and yeah, and then we'll just build up from there. So, what is Angular, and what is Ionic? Sorry. Now, you should already be familiar with Angular before starting this video series, as it just builds up on top of Angular. But Ionic is an open source mobile UI toolkit for building high quality and cross-platform native and web app experiences. And you only have to write one code base with your web-based knowledge. So this isn't just Angular. You can use React or Vue, although we'll be focusing on Angular in this series. And using that one code base, it actually can generate iOS apps, Android apps, and even PWA and Electron apps. So with the ability to just write one code base and create Android and iOS projects, it's really quite a powerful tool, and it's really not a lot to it. If you've used Angular Material before, it's just like using some pre-built components. You can add in some of the Ionic services to do some more controller-like functions, as we'll see. And you just type in a command and it spits out the Android and iOS applications with Capacitor, and then you can upload those to the Play or App Store. The Ionic framework has a UI component library, and it has really good documentation on how to use each of the components. So there's buttons, cards, checkboxes, chips, a whole bunch of components that we can use. And this is the go-to place for looking at any examples. So for example, if you want to look at a button, you just come to this iron button. You can see it on Android and iOS, so you can see that the one component for Iron Button, it just creates both the versions for both of the platforms, and also for a web platform as well. So let's go ahead and create our very first Ionic application. So the very first thing you need to do is you need to run npm install, and you can install it globally to get the Ionic CLI. Now I've already got this, so go ahead and download that and install that with no package manager. After you've done that, you can run an Ionic start, and this creates an application for you. Now you can choose your framework. Here we'll choose Angular, and we can give it a project name. So I'm going to call this LinkedIn, and I'm going to start with a blank starter project so we can explain everything along the way. So we will integrate Capacitor to target native iOS and Android. because you can just use this Ionic just for building web applications if you like, as a UI library. But the main reason you would want to use it is to build a hybrid cross-platform application for mobile as well. Or you could just use the components if you like. They're quite good. So here I am in my LinkedIn clone project. Now note, I have this API folder here. If you haven't followed along with the previous video where we built a Nest, just the CRUD operations, just to introduce ourselves to Nest.js. So if you're a Node and Angular developer and you are interested in learning about Nest.js, this is the complete guide for beginners for both Nest.js and Ionic. So we'll just wait for this to load. And you do not have to create a Ionic account, so you can just click no. Now let's sort of start to take a look at the folder structure here. Now you'll notice that it's very similar to the Angular project from the ng new project, and there's just a few extra files here. So you can firstly look at the package.json file. It's always a great place to start, and it's pretty much the same as an Angular project would be. It just has Ionic Angular for the Ionic UI components that are cross-platform, and it also has capacitor to be able to render into and render any native features such as the camera, or build the project to those source folders. Now there is this Ionic config.json file, and this just names the project and gives it some metadata of the type. So you can have Vue and React here, so it just lets it know that it's of type Angular. And there's also this capacitor config JSON file. And this app ID and app name, this is what's used inside of the App Store. So you can rename these here when you go to deploy your application. But right now this is just a very introductory video. So if we take a look at our source folder here, it almost looks identical here, but there's one extra folder here, and that's theme. So there's theme and there's variables. So by default, Ionic comes with some various different colors here. So you got your primary color, similar to Material or something, or Bootstrap or something like that, where they have their primary and secondary colors. They got primary, secondary, tertiary, and so on, with various tints. Now inside of the app folder, it automatically generates this home module for us. So we have this app module here, and it includes the Ionic module for root. And inside of the app component, we have this thing called an Ion router outlet, and we have an Ion router outlet instead of a router outlet because Ionic wraps the Angular router outlet and adds additional features to it. So for example, when you're routing and navigating to different pages on a mobile, it actually stacks the pages up. So when you're on a browser and you go to a new page, the previous page is essentially lost. You can do some caching and stuff like that, but Ionic does some of the caching for you, and it also keeps the page open. So there's also some more lifecycle hooks in addition to ng on init and those things for entering to the page that you're on and when it's left and stuff like that. But we'll see that in another video. In this video, we're just going to focus more on the UI side of things. Now it generates this home module, and a home module is just it's just the same as a regular module that you generate with Angular, except the one key difference here is you have Ionic components. So just like you can create your own app components for your app, so you might have a app-header in Angular, you can use these pre-built components. So they're just prefixed with the Ion word prefix, before each of the components, and of course you can just use any input variables or attributes and stuff like that, and you can see all of that in the documentation, of course. But the very first thing we're doing for our LinkedIn clone is we will want to get the colors right. Now I've already selected these colors, so I'm just going to copy them over. But if you did want to generate your own colors, you can just come to this ionicframework.com/doc/theming/color generator, and you can start to change the colors and generate your theme. So I'm just going to copy that from my other project into this project. So you do this in this variables.scss file here. I'm just going to go ahead and delete all this, and I'm going to go over to my other project that I've built beforehand and just copy those in there. So I've just essentially found the LinkedIn colors from selecting them online with the select tool in Google Chrome, and also I've seen a few also just by typing in LinkedIn color palette. So you're just basically having a bunch of CSS variables here on the root, so you're able to access those throughout your application, and you can also use them as properties on the components to change the color, of course. So the first thing I might do before we get started is I might just run an Ionic Serve just to see what the boilerplate Ionic is. And you do have to cd into the directory, of course. So Ionic Serve is the command, and this opens on localhost port 8100. So this just takes a second to load up and compile, especially the first time. Usually takes a little longer the first time. And essentially we get something like this. Now it takes us to the home route, and we just got a blank navigation and a message here. You might have some different colors by default. It might be a darker color, and that's just because I changed the coloring. So if you get a different color, don't freak out or anything. And I think by default now they're using this dark theme. So what you can do is, if you want to sort of not use the dark theme by default, is you can actually come to the index file, and you can just remove this dark bit here. Now we're not going to see any effects here, but if you didn't change the colors you will. And essentially this is to help if you have like something like light mode or dark mode, it can change between the light and dark colors that you've predefined. So I'm going to uncompile or stop compiling, and I'm going to generate our first component. So I want to run the Ionic generate component command. Now in this home module, I want to have a folder called components, so components that are relevant to the home module, and I want to have a header component, and that's what we're going to call our navigation bar. So we can just go to the home module just to check that it has been imported. And it has not been imported, so we'll import that ourselves. So next to the home page we can have the header component, we called it, and that can just auto import there. So now we have that in our home module, and now we can start to work on our header component. Now before I do that, I might just go to our home page and then just delete everything here, and I might just do we'll take a look at the selector here. So app-header, and we can put that into our home page and press tab to get some IntelliSense and auto completion. And we can go ahead and we can just delete all of this SCSS, and we can also just delete these spec files because we won't be doing any testing in this video. So we'll remove those, and now we can start to begin on our header component. So we can actually rerun Ionic Serve here. And actually, before I do that, I might just generate one more component so I don't have to rerun this again. So in the demonstration, you've seen that there was this popover component that popped the extra menu features out. So I'm just going to create that component ahead of time, and you'll see how it comes into play as we go along. But that's related to the header folder. It's related to the header, so I'm going to put that inside of that folder there. And I'm just going to call this Popover, and I've called it Popover because that's what they call it in the documentation, and that's the name of the component. And once again, I'm just going to delete this spec file here. It's probably a command to skip the test like in Angular, but I haven't researched that just yet. So let's build our header then. So I'll just run Ionic Serve in the background, and we can start by using, we want an iron toolbar. So we just use we go into the UI documentation, and we can see that we have some examples here, both for iOS and Android, of the toolbar at the top. And we can see that we can just use an iron toolbar, and we could have some buttons in there. We could also have an iron header and things like that. So I'll just show you how I've created the navigation bar. So you can just come here, and you can either copy the code as a starting point, but I've actually modified it a little bit. So the iron header, this has a class called iron container, and this is just, there's a bunch of utility classes, such if you're familiar with Tailwind, where you got classes, or something like Bootstrap where you got classes such as padding right and padding left and stuff like that. It's more or less the same thing. These are just prefixed with the word iron. So there's iron padding none, and stuff like that, and we'll see those as we work through. And we can go ahead and we can have something like iron no border, because by default, if you look at the documentation here, there's actually this box shadow here, so we want to have something custom here. And I've already made a small mistake here. This iron container, this is actually this is created by myself. Actually, please disregard that. Everything's okay. I'm just getting ahead of myself here. I built, I applied my own class. So instead of having that shadow on the bottom, I just had like my own line. But that's actually within a nested element here. So I've got within the iron header, we can have an iron toolbar. And I'm going to create a class here. And when you create a class, don't use the prefix iron, because you don't want to confuse yourself between the built-in classes and the ones that you've created yourself in addition. So this toolbar wrapper, we can start with that in the CSS. Now you do normally want to just use the iron classes and the utility methods, but sometimes you need to do something custom. So if you're customizing elements, it's easy enough just to go into the SCSS file and change something there. So for the toolbar wrapper, we can just say display flex, and this is just going to wrap the entire toolbar. Now I want to have a max width of 1128 pixels, and I got that number from the LinkedIn website. I logged into LinkedIn and I seen how long all of the elements in the toolbar were, and it turns out they're about that. And then you want to have spacing on either side, so I can set the margin to auto here, and I think I did the bottom border in another element here. So we have our toolbar, and we have a div inside of it. So actually I might put this class on the div inside of it here, and I might start off by adding some buttons. So there's a iron buttons component, and inside of the iron buttons it can take iron button, and once again this is all in the documentation. So you can take an iron button here. Now on my buttons I don't want any padding, so I don't want a big space between them, so I'm just going to say iron no padding. So there's a utility method, and there's also this thing called slots, so you can position them where you want, and I think by default they're at the starting position, but you could do something to align it, like there might be a little bit more spacing or something like that. So if you have start, let's say you had one icon on a navigation bar, it would be at the beginning with a bit of space, but you could have end or something like that, and then it will push everything to the right. So slots are just placeholders for the positioning of where you want the element. And then we have an iron button, and inside of our iron button we want to have an iron icon because we want the LinkedIn icon. And on the LinkedIn icon we're going to have a custom class here called LinkedIn logo. Now to get the type of the icon, you can actually come to the documentation here, and you can come to icons, and it takes you to an external link, and then they have a bunch of icons here. So we could choose LinkedIn for example. If you click on it, it comes up with this toast message, and you can actually click on this and you can copy it to your clipboard, and you can go ahead and you can just come back to your Visual Studio Code, and you could just paste that in here, and you could search all the other icons, and it's just like Font Awesome, except these icons, if you've ever used Font Awesome, you know that sometimes the centering is a little off, and then when you position things, you know, you might have to do some margin, -2 pixels, and just to align everything. Well, this sort of takes away that problem, and I'll just copy this class over before I forget about it. And when you use these icons in conjunction with items and other Ionic features, everything just aligns up magically. Obviously they done the coding behind the scenes, and we can just use the UI library, so that's really handy. So and I might just add the LinkedIn class here, so I'll copy this into my SCSS file. So all I really want to do here is I want to have the font size, and I want to make it a little larger. Now there are things you can do here. You can use this size equals large or size equals small, and these sizes and slots and stuff like that, they work on a lot of Ionic components. But because I'm doing a LinkedIn clone, I needed a very specific number, so it simulates that of the LinkedIn website. So I just did some custom sizing here. So let's just save that and see what this gives us. And we can see here that we've got this label here, and we can already start to see that's not all the way to the left because of our 1128. If we press F12 here and we make it a little bigger here, we can actually see that 28, and then the margin just either side scales as the browser gets larger and larger. So we want this to be the LinkedIn color, and I've already added that into the global variables, and I've actually made that the primary color. So what we can do is we can come to this iron icon. So let's just go ahead and add this color attribute, and we can say that we want the color to be primary, and these are in the global variables. There's primary, tertiary, and you can just look at the names there or in the documentation, and we can save that. And now we can see that we've got our heading with this LinkedIn logo here, so we're already on our way. So what we can do next is we can have the LinkedIn search bar, and there's actually an iron search bar, so that makes it really easy for us to create. And I'm just going to add a class here on the Ionic search bar, and this class is going to be iron hide large down. Now what this does for us, when the size of the screen gets to large, and there's various breakpoints in the documentation, and what this means is usually this applies to everything above. So there's a whole bunch of classes basically that sort of scale or are applied based off the screen size. So to illustrate this, it's easier just to show the documentation. But apparently there's XS, SM, MD, LG, and XL for extra small, small, medium, large, and XL. And these get applied when you reach the number. So when you reach 576 pixels, that's considered small. When you reach 768 pixels, that's considered medium, and so on. So 992 and 1200. Now this is for the split pane, but I do believe these numbers are the same for all of the components. And there's actually a bunch of utility classes. So if we go to guide and we come to CSS utilities, actually responsive grid, we can see these breakpoints here. So they actually do differ a little bit, but they're very close. And this is in relation to the grid. Oh no, they are these values, so disregard that. But basically what we can do is for our utility class methods, we can suffix it with the screen size code, and then that class will get applied based on the size. So here's something what I'm looking for. So this is actually a CSS variable, but it's the same utility classes exist in the template. So this one, iron grid padding, so they're all prefixed with iron. Then you have what they're doing, so this is some grid padding, and then there's the size of it, so XS, SM, And this turns out to be all the same, but there's a whole bunch of these classes that can be suffixed with the size, such that when the it just makes it very responsive, so you can handle changes in the browser. Because this you're in this hybrid application, you're building for mobile, tablets, and desktop. Now, I know you do that in normal web application builds, but it's critically important here because we're specifically designing mobile applications as well. So there's some instances where you want to hide elements, or depending on the size of the screen, you want, maybe you've seen websites where there's extra data, extra text presented, depending on the screen size. So that was a small tangent I went off there, but it's good to know because this is an introductory Ionic video here. So let's come back to our application and continue to build out the navigation bar. And basically, we want to hide this if it's less than large, because there's not enough size in the navigation bar to have the search bar as well on mobile devices. So we just want to remove the search bar in that case. So I've got this color here. Oops, the property goes on the element or the component, and I've made the tertiary, I've selected a light blue, which is in line with the LinkedIn color. And then we can just have a placeholder here, search, and this will have the magnifying glass in the iron component. Now, next to our iron buttons, basically we have the LinkedIn logo on the search on the left, and then on the right side we want to have the other icons that we can click. So I'm actually going to do an iron grid for this, and the reason being is because I need to have icons and text, and I need to position them vertically. So I'm going to make make an iron grid with an iron row, and this is another fundamental layout concept. It's similar to sort of Bootstrap or Material, something like that. The grid, there's 12 columns in a row by default, and a row is just a row, so like a navigation bar is one big row basically. If there was two navigation bars stacked on top of each other, there'd be two rows. But this is actually, this iron grid needs to surround whenever you use rows or columns, you need to use this iron grid to tell Ionic that you're using like a layout template. So you always need this Ionic grid, and it's important to note that iron row comes first. You can't do iron column first like you could in Bootstrap or something like that. So you do the iron row, and then inside the iron row, that's where you can have your iron columns. So I'm basically going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 iron columns. So I'm going to say iron-col, and I'm going to give it an attribute here. So I'm going to say size equals to auto, and I want 6 of these, so I can use Emmet to generate 6 of those. So we know by default a column, it will take all of the space in the row, but for our icons I only want the them to take the width of the icon. And actually, in fact, I actually want them to be a fixed width because that's how they lay them out in LinkedIn. So if I say come to the styling, firstly the icons, I want them to be of a font size of 24 pixels. But these iron columns, I want them to have a width of 80 pixels. And I need to make this important to override the default iron col. And I could make it the specificity higher, but I'll just chuck in the important text there. So the text align, I want the icon and the text to be centered. So I'll say text align equal to center. And I also want to make the search bar, so by default it has some box shadow. So the search bar we just created, I want to get rid of the box shadow. And there's actually this variable, and this is in a lot of these elements. So let's come to components here, and let's go to search bar. So in addition to the properties that you can see in the documentation here, there's also, well, there's methods or events that can happen, so on blur or something like that, and you can handle those and call a function in those cases. But there's also custom styling. So you probably want to use these first before you use your own styling, but sometimes these properties don't exist. But in this case, box shadow, that does exist. So we can come to the variable, and then it has the benefit of scoping within the component here. And we can just say we want the box shadow to be none. And by default, the buttons, because I got an iron button here, and I just realized this iron button should be going around the iron icon logo, so the search bar is different to that. But because the button for the logo and the search bar are in this buttons, there's actually this space. So in addition, I need to say, we'll just have a look at that. So the spacing isn't too bad, but the size is a little big. So I actually want to make this a little smaller. And I didn't find any easy ways of doing this. I mean, I found an easy way to do it, but I didn't find any clean ways of doing this. So my hack is to say transform, and then use the scale of 0.8 here. And that creates the extra space here when you use this scaling here. So to circumvent that undesirable spacing, we can actually just say, we can just push this margin left of 40 pixels. So now we can see that the search bar is closer to the icon, and when we go below the certain size of the screen, like the mobile size, then the search bar disappears. And also when you go over the largest breakpoint, then the minimum width of the navigation bar is preserved. with the scaling margin in the horizontal plane. So if we come back to our iron grid, where we want to be doing the other icons as per the LinkedIn navigation bar, what we want to do on the iron row here is we want to push all that to the right. So we can just say iron justify content n, and it should be noted that grid, it uses flex box behind the scenes, so it's good to know that because it just builds up on that. And yeah, you should be familiar with those classes, and if not, just check it out. It only takes 5 minutes and it's extremely handy. So inside of an iron coal, I want an iron icon, and I want the home icon in the first icon case, and I also just want a div because there's the home text that defines the icon here. So we can see that we've got home here. So let's go ahead and we'll just add a few more of these icons and text in. So the second icon that we want is we want the people icon for my network. We want the briefcase icon for jobs. And once again, this is in the documentation in the icons section we seen earlier. I've already picked these out. They're not exactly the same as LinkedIn, but they're pretty close. So the chat box ellipses, that's for messaging. Then there's the icon notifications, and that's for the notifications, so I might just copy that. And then finally there is the there's actually, this last one actually isn't a iron icon, it's actually an image, but I'm just going to use a placeholder just for a second until we line everything up. And this is me. So let's just see that. Okay, so one thing we're noting here is that the widths of these, they're actually wrapping, and we don't necessarily want wrapping of the text. So let's fix that. Let's go to the header component SCSS, and basically we want to make the font size a little smaller, and we want to make the weighting a little less. So let's just go to the iron coal and the div, and we want the font size to be 12 pixels, and we want the font weight to be 400, let's say. So let's save that. So now we can see we've got our nice icons here. Now, notice that there's no bottom border here, and that's because we purposely removed the extra box shadow. But LinkedIn, they just have this singular line look. So if we look at our iron header here, we can just go ahead and copy that. So that means here, we can make our own custom bottom border here. And I'm just going to make this 1 pixel solid. And I'm going to use a root variable, so they're defined in the global variables. And I pre-selected this. So iron color, light tint. And now we got this line here, so it's looking a little more LinkedIn-ish. So let's come back to our application. Now, we don't want me and a home symbol here. We want a image here, and also we want to show a little notification badge here. Now this is going to be hard coded, of course, but in later videos hopefully we'll get to creating the functionality behind the UI. So let's continue. If we look at our notifications, we want to have an iron badge. So instead of well, in addition to the iron icon, we want an iron badge here. And because this is hard coded, we can just let's say we wanted 2 there. Basically we're just going to do an inline style here for now, and we might come to refactoring this in a later video. But basically what we want is we want it to be absolute, so we're able to position it with the margin left, and we want to make that -10 pixels. We want a margin top of -5 pixels. We want to make the height 16 pixels and the width also 16 pixels. And we want to make the border radius fully rounded, so we can just say 9999 pixels. And we also want the additional property of the color, and we want that to be red for a notification, so we can have this danger color here. And we can see that we've got our notification here. It just looks a little bit off, so let's just tweak the styling a little bit. And actually the styling will be the same as this iron coal div for the iron badge. We just want the text to be a little smaller and the weighting to be a little smaller. Yeah, so that looks a lot better. So let's get our image in. So here, rather than using an icon here, we can say iron-avatar, and that's going to be a circular image, and there's another component for a squared image, but that actually wraps, the circular one wraps the iron image. And I'm going to need the image, so I'm going to copy my profile picture into the assets folder. So I'm just going to paste this in here. This is just a profile pic of me. Now that means we can now source that image from our files. So we're just going to have to go back a few directories here and go to the assets folder and then get our profile picture. Now, in addition to that, I'm going to want to reformat the size of the image, and I want to get that in line with the other logos. So let's do that. So in the styling, I can come to the SCSS file for the header component, and I can just say Doesn't really matter where. There's no specificity collages here, so I can just say the Ion avatar needs to be smaller, so let's just make the width 24 pixels, the same as the icon size. We want it to be circular. Well, it is circular, but we need to preserve the circularity with the height being the same as the width. And then I need to center it to make it nice and in line. And now we just need to fix the alignment of this. So let's go back to the header. And in the div here, we'll just add a inline style here. And we'll just say display, flex, justify content, center, align items, center. And we also just want a caret. So there's the ability to click down on this with the visual aid. So we can say Ion icon, and it has a style of font size 16 pixels. So let's just get that. And the name of the icon is caret down outline. So now we've got a nice visual cue to click on this. So basically what we want to do now is when we click on this, we want a popover to come up, and we can look at the documentation here to see this in action. So let's just look at an example here. Show popover, and then we get a pop down menu here, and we just want to build that. So we actually need to use a service to inject that, because there's a little bit of functionality that goes into that. Basically, you can just come to the usage and you just import the controller that you need that does that. And recall that we created a popover component earlier already, and that component is what gets rendered in that drop down menu. So you just need to set it up by injecting the service and having a function, an asynchronous function, and that gets fired when you click the that particular image. So we're going to have a click event here, and it's going to call that. So they called it present popover. And one thing that isn't specified clearly in the documentation is if you don't pass the event, it can't detect that it's in relation to this column. So if you put this event here, it can say it's in relation to this component or element that this component renders. So rather than having the pop up in the middle, it can pop up in the next to the element. So in our case, the top right. So we're going to need the header component here, and we can just go ahead and we can copy the import statement from the controller, or well, of the controller. So let's get that in there, and we'll copy over the injection. Now this is public. It needs to use the external component, and we can just copy this entirely, this asynchronous function here. all we need to do is we just need to import that, and I've named it the same, so we can just import it like that. So let's go ahead and save that, and we'll also save that, and we'll see what this gives us. So we got Popover works, so that's just the HTML text. Now I'll just show you what happens if you don't put in an event. So it pops up in the middle, and you might want that in some circumstances, but in the clone we want it closer to the element itself. So we don't want it exactly like that, we want it down a little bit, but we'll come to the styling in just a second. Basically what we want to do is see this my custom class here. We want to apply a custom class which actually gets applied to the component, but before I even do that, this translucent, so this is in between transparent and opaque, so it's sort of like a clear but muddy clear sort of backdrop. So we don't actually want that, we just want like a nice white backdrop. And notice that this actually brings up this overlay with all this black over the screen. Well, we don't necessarily want that. So there's also this other property, and this is, once again, it's all in the documentation. So you just go to the component and scroll down and read through it. But we don't want to show the backdrop. And when it gets dismissed by clicking on something else, we can see in the console here, if you click off, and basically anything that isn't this, you click off it, it's able to detect that in the window, and then it calls that function. So that can be useful if you need to have additional functionality. But basically in our global SCSS file here, where we've got all our imports to Ionic, because we have a pop-up overlay menu, it can't be accessed directly, so we need to apply a global styling, and it needs to be specific enough for the component, for the popover to be able to render it. So we have that my custom class as defined in the CSS class, and then there's also this popover content, and that just is generated for us, that class there. So that's how it gets applied. And I just want to add a few things here. I want the width to be 300 pixels. I want a margin top to be 16 pixels, just to bring it down a little bit, because we can see that it's sort of over this line here. So let's bring it down a little. And then there's also this CSS variable for the box shadow, akin to the navigation bar. So we don't want any of that. So let's get rid of that. And we save that. And now we get Popover works. Okay, so we just sort of want to work on the popover itself now. So notice that there's no border or anything like that. We just want to work on the styling. So let's do that. So let's go to our popover component, and basically this is going to be a card. So let's say we want a card, we want a card header, and to lay it out, we're going to, whenever we're doing anything with layout, we can use the default components, or we can use the grid to lay it out. So I can use the grid here, and the grid, it's going to have a row nested inside of it, and we know that to lay it out there's going to be a column inside of that, and we're actually actually going to have 2 columns. So the iron row, we want everything to be centered both vertically and horizontally. So we can add the iron align item center and iron justify content center. And inside of our first column, we want to once again have our avatar image, and that has the iron image, so the circular image. And we can just go ahead and use our IntelliSense to find where that is. So we need to go back a few directories here, back to the assets, and we can get the profile JPEG that I saved just previously. So this will have the image, the circular image on the left, and then on the right we want to have the username and role. So I'm going to have iron card title here, and I'm going to put my name here, just going to hard code it. And I'm also going to have the iron card subtitle, and I can put a hard coded role here, a full stack developer, and below the okay, something went wrong here with the, I must have typed it in wrong, but this should be an iron grid here. Let's see. So the iron card header, now inside of the iron card header, I'll have that. So let's just see where that puts us. So now we've got this here and this here. So let's just continue to work on that. Yeah. Okay. So just outside of this iron grid here, we need to have a button. So let's just say iron button, and it has this property called expand equals block, and that, so it takes the that takes the full width rather than being inline. We can make it a little smaller than default because it's quite large, and that's just outline. So rather than it being fully blue or the primary color, we can just say fill outline, and of course we want the color to be primary, and this is going to say view profile. So let's check this out. Okay, so we can see we've got that, so it's coming along. And let's just add, outside of the iron card header, we'll have our iron card content, and we can say we'll have an iron card subtitle with the color dark, and that's just to distinguish the highlight, distinguish the main sections. So in the account category, I'm going to have a P with the class iron padding top times 3. So we're going to have settings and privacy. We're going to have help, and we're going to have language here. So let's just see what this does. So we can see that we've got our heading in bold, and then our 3 other links that we can click there. Now these are just going to be hard coded. We're not actually going to build the entire LinkedIn here, but just the features of interest to help us as developers and learn this new tool here. Now outside of this iron card content here, I'm just going to have a div with the class item divider. Now there is a class called iron item divider, but that brings in a lot of spacing, and it's not trivial how to remove that extra spacing. So I'm just going to make the item divider in an analogous way to the line under the navigation bar, and it's quite simple. So basically I want to just copy this again, and I might just split up the code a little here so it looks a little easier to read. So in the iron card content, I'm going to have a manage section. Get rid of one of these. This one I'll change to post and activities, and this one I'll change to job posting account. We've got our next item divider, and let's just get one more of these in. Now all we need here is a p tag and we don't even need the padding on the top, and we can just have sign out here. So let's click this. Alright, now I haven't actually created the classes yet, so once I do that, everything should be looking great. So let's do that in our SCSS file here. So the item divider, I'm just going to have a bottom here, 1 pixel solid, and I'm going to use the global variable defined in the iron in the root for the iron color light tint. And on the card content, for each of the p tags, I'm just going to give the illusion that they're links. So I'll set the declaration to underline when you hover over a link, and the cursor to pointer. So now we've got these horizontal lines, we've got this sign out here, so let's just add the functionality, or the mock functionality. And one thing I noticed is this looks a little close, so what we'll do is we'll come up to our iron coal here, the first one where the image is, and recall that the coal takes up the width by default, but if we set it to auto, it will just take up that space that it requires. So yeah, so now that looks all lined up. And just to finish off on the sign out, and we will actually hook this up with authentication, both on the back end and front end. So we've got this method here on sign out, so that means we need to add that to the component. And I might just console log the message on sign out chord. So we've got our navigation bar, and we can resize it such that the search bar disappears. Now if we go super small, we can see that the flex behavior wraps, and it's quite nice, but we will actually have a different setup for mobile view. So that'll be in a later video. And if we go very large, over the 1200 mark, we get that scaling header. We've got all of these icons nicely set up. We've got our Popover controller set up to display the Popover component. We've got a mock of the links and what everything looks like. And then we've got this function here, and it calls on sign out chord. So this wraps up this video of an introduction to Ionic with Angular and the full stack LinkedIn clone. In the next video, I'm going to continue to work on the layout of this LinkedIn clone. So please follow along with the series, and if you like it, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.